All right, and we're live now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're watching us. My name is Ermin Sinanović. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And welcome to our today's discussion on peaceful families. We have 4 distinguished guests and speakers today with us. I will not spend much time introducing them so that we can save the time for the conversation, but I will post their bios in the YouTube live chat, so you can click on the link and read their full bio. And as for those of you who are on our Twitter and Facebook, you have had the opportunity to read the flyer and see their bios. I'm going to just introduce them as they come to speak with a very brief introduction, one-liner. This is one of the discussions that the CICW had been hosting. We've been hosting these discussions for the past several months. They have been primarily book discussions, so it's usually one-on-one, but this time we have a little bit different format. We do have a book discussion that is built into this conversation, but we also have other panel participants who are going to highlight different issues that the book talks about. They're going to reflect on the book. They're going to reflect on their own work related to the theme that the book talks about. And the book that we are talking about and that we are discussing today is this book, Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence by Dr. Juliane Hammer, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she is going to be our first guest. Our other guests are Dr. Zainab Alwani, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at Howard University, Imam Mohamed Magid, who is Imam of Adams Center in Virginia, and then Salma Abugideiri, who is a founding member of Peaceful Family Project, also based in Virginia. She is also a therapist and a counselor and has a lot of experience with dealing with these cases and issues. So in order to save our time, I'm going to jump into discussion immediately. And the format is going to be as follows. For the first about 20 minutes, I'm going to converse with Dr. Hammer about her book. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to have that conversation. After we are done with our conversation, then each of the 3 other panelists are going to have about 10 to 12 minutes each. And I'm going to ask 2 to 3 questions of each of them, and they can choose to answer whichever aspect of the question if they cannot answer the whole question, and highlight their own work in this field. After we are done with all 4 panel participants, I'm going to open it up for discussion. So I'm going to lead the discussion among the panelists, but I'm also going to involve you, the YouTube audience, which is we're going to take questions. So please, in YouTube, you have a chat option. So if you hear something you didn't understand, if you have a comment or something, or you have a question, submit it there. And when we come to the part of the conversation where we engage the audience, we're going to take as many of your comments and questions as we can. So without further ado, our first speaker is Dr. Juliane Hammer. Dr. Hammer, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here to be able to talk about my book, and I'm especially excited about the other 3 panelists and that conversation.
Thank you so much. So we're going to immediately delve into the first question. So it's a question that I ask every time I'm talking to a book author, and the question is, why did you write the book?
So this book, which it took me a very long time to write, unlike other work that I have done, grew out of 2 things. One is a moment, and one is work that I had done before, which focused on Muslim women's activism and questions of religious authority, religious leadership, and mosque space. And there were moments in that work where there was talk of domestic violence as an issue, and that's one of the ways in which I became interested in that as a topic. The other one was a specific moment in February 2009 when Asya Zubair was murdered by her husband, which brought domestic violence as an issue to the forefront of Muslim community conversations. And it also highlighted, in a way that hadn't happened before, the fact that there were and are, in fact, many Muslim organizations and advocates. And so I decided around that time in 2009 that this deserved attention. And I would say that I wrote the book primarily to highlight the work of these advocates, the work that Muslim advocates do in relation to Muslim communities. And I decided, because I'm not a social work scholar or criminal justice scholar, that I would focus on those aspects. First of all, that I would not focus on domestic violence as a fact in Muslim communities. There are others that have done that work, but to focus on the efforts against domestic violence, and specifically the ones that were carried out by Muslims from within what I describe in the book as a religious framework. The book is based on several years of ethnographic fieldwork. So I interviewed a significant number of people, some repeatedly, and I participated in person and sometimes also virtually in many, many different types of events that I observed, took notes on, and that I present and analyze in the book. And I also draw on a really large collection of what I describe as textual materials, but that includes more than books and articles and things that are sort of typically textual, but also YouTube videos. For example, Imam Magid has spoken on camera, and there's a YouTube video where he talks about the issue of domestic violence. So these are textual materials that I also include in the book.
Thank you very much for this concise and direct and very good answer to my question. So we move to the second question immediately. So how do you, in your book, define domestic violence? And why are efforts against domestic violence sometimes seen as problematic in Muslim communities?
Mm-hmm. So that's two questions, just for the record, not one. And I will say that the how do you define domestic violence question is actually not that simple to answer, because the terminology that is used in the domestic violence field varies significantly. And sometimes there is even sort of an ideological component to how people use certain types of terminology. So for example, to make a distinction between domestic violence and intimate partner violence, which is a term that exists as well. And so I ended up settling on something along the lines of, for me, domestic violence includes physical, emotional, financial, and spiritual abuse, and other forms of a pattern of abusive relationships in which one partner has power and control over the other. And so I focus in the book and in my work on couples, even though I also acknowledge that there are forms of domestic violence in which the victims are, for example, elders or children. And the second part of the question about why it is hard to talk about, my experience has actually been that it's hard to talk about in all communities. In fact, my experience as a researcher, as a scholar, and as an academic has been that literally no one wants to talk about domestic violence. And I think it's partly because it is an uncomfortable subject, because it forces us to acknowledge how common it is, and that it happens to people we know, and that we all also know people who are perpetrators. And so there is a sort of a personal level on which it is really a difficult subject. And I don't think that Muslims are special in their refusal to, or in their difficulty with it, in the challenge that they face with that. And part of it for me, and I still carry that after all the years that I've been doing this work, I still have moments where I simply can't believe that some people do these types of things to other people. It's like on the level of really just accepting that these are things that happen. And I will bring in something that might come up later again, for Muslims in the US context, which the book focuses on. There's an additional issue with the scrutiny that Muslims are under, both from the state and from the wider society, because of anti-Muslim hostility and the ease with which any form of violence perpetrated by Muslims is linked to them being Muslims, who are then uniquely portrayed as other and different and not fitting in US society.
Well, thank you so much again for a wonderful answer to these questions. I'm really struck by what you said, is that nobody really wants to talk about domestic violence, and that shouldn't surprise us. At the same time, it is there, and obviously for that reason, the work that the four of you and many others are doing is so important. The next question I have for you, Dr. Hammer, is what are some of the major efforts, initiatives in the American Muslim community in addressing domestic violence? I think your book covers many of these, and actually all three other panelists are covered in your book as leaders, academics, scholars, practitioners who are contributing to addressing this problem in our community. So can you tell us more about these major efforts and initiatives?
Mm-hmm. So in the book, one of the things I try to do is sort of bring a little bit of organization into the kinds of efforts that I see happening. Some of that is artificial because many of the advocates I work with are people who do more than one of those things. So the three that I described there is, the first one is raising awareness of the existence and the dynamics of domestic violence, specifically in Muslim communities. So awareness efforts that can take many different forms, but that's sort of the focus of that work. The second one is to provide direct services to victims and survivors. Those are most often, for obvious reasons, localized efforts. So the awareness work can be national and is also always local, but the services have to be developed and offered in localized contexts. And the third one is various types of training for mainstream service providers, lawyers, law enforcement. So anyone who can also and will also come in contact with Muslim victims and survivors, and occasionally also perpetrators, to help them understand that there are specific needs and approaches that Muslims may need in order for these mainstream services to be effective. So these are sort of the three main categories. And as I said, many of the people I interviewed and observed do more than one of those. And the other thing that I will say, so there's a landscape that I describe in the book of Muslim DV organizations. So when I say DV organizations, I mean anti-DV organizations. It's just a mouthful to say that every time. None of the people I'm talking about are advocating for domestic violence, just so that I said it. So there are many different organizations. I did not interview or talk to or even know about all of them. But the purpose of the book was not to provide a sort of sociological map of domestic violence efforts. I was interested in a qualitative approach. And so there are organizations like Peaceful Families, which was one of my first sort of points of reference. There are also networks and organizations that do not exclusively focus on domestic violence, but do work in the field of social services, for example, that may include service work specifically for domestic violence survivors. And then there is another category that is probably the most difficult to capture, which is Muslims who work in the mainstream domestic violence movement, and who may or may not utilize what I describe as religious frameworks. What I will also say is that the book is sort of a historical work in some sense, because the landscape that I was talking about is constantly changing. It doesn't stay the same. There are various reasons for that. It's one of the things that I was interested in exploring in the book. So for one, and I have nothing but endless respect for the people who do that work on the ground. It's exhausting. And it's incredibly hard to do every day. And so like that type of emotionally difficult work also leads to burnout. And so one of the things that I saw even in the time that I was working was people who were involved in the Muslim anti-DV movement and had to stop, had to do other things, couldn't stay with it. Sometimes people also come back to it. There's a second issue that I want to acknowledge that I talk a lot about in the book, which is funding, which goes back to Muslim communities, but also the wider society. If people don't want to talk about domestic violence, they certainly don't want to give money to that as a cause, because that also acknowledges that it exists. And that struggle for funding is something that affects the ways in which people can maintain or create organizations. So sometimes organizations simply disappear because they no longer have the funds to maintain themselves and maintain the work that they're doing. So I think that was a really important thing for me, that in writing the book, I'm capturing something that no longer is, even though many of the broader issues are still the same and are still issues that I think we need to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that really struck me as I was reading the book is you bring up this issue of Islam and culture. And we see that not only related to domestic violence. Whenever something undesirable happens in the Muslim community, people would say, well, that's not Islam, that's culture. But to what extent can we disaggregate the two? I mean, culture is a big part of Islam, and Islam is a big part of culture. So how do we deal with that issue, and how did you deal with it in your book?
Mm-hmm. So I'd start by saying that the relationship between religion and culture more generally is one of the sort of perpetual and perhaps perennial topics that religious studies scholars think about and are interested in. And I started writing about it in the book because it kept showing up in communal conversations. So I didn't make up this distinction. It shows up in a variety of ways. And so I was interested in the ways in which it shows up in the domestic violence work, because I would argue that it's not always the same relationship, right? So yes, as you said, it often shows up as Islam is good and culture is bad when we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with a contentious issue. But I actually find that what happens in the DV work, and that's why I write about it so much in the book, is much more nuanced than that. So both Islam and culture, or cultures in the plural perhaps, are treated by different advocates and religious leaders as a potential resource and as a potential roadblock. That resource roadblock dynamic, which I learned about from reading about efforts against domestic violence and speaking with people, is I think a really useful tool to not end up with a binary where one thing's good and one thing's bad. And we even have the moments in the book where Islam obviously is a resource, but culture can also be a resource. So we're making culture sort of the enemy of the good is not actually a productive way to go about that. And I was interested in these as what I see as very intentional ways to set up this relationship. So one of the things it does, especially if it's Islam is good and culture is the problem, is help advocates answer the question of why domestic violence happens, and that it isn't related to Islam, but from within Islam, there are resources that are authoritative and thus helpful for ending domestic violence. And so I describe it in the book as a really powerful tool to be able to say, the Quran speaks, and through the Quran, God speaks against domestic violence. Period. Not maybe, but however, we could interpret it differently, but with a kind of authority that is also necessary, because domestic abuse is not very much about grayscale, but about like the magnitude of the violence that's inflicted on people. And I might add, as a scholar, with the scholar hat on, I would say, no, you can't disaggregate them. There is no religion without culture. And in most contexts, there's also no culture without religion. But I find sort of arguing in that way or analyzing in that way, I found that in the book, that was not a productive way to go about it. And I very, very, very much do not want to criticize or deconstruct these approaches and these ways of talking about the two, because what I found was that they're very effective tools in this work.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that is very important. In your books, you also write about where Muslims are situated in the wider social narrative on domestic violence, Islamophobia, other important issues, how they are interrelated. I think you hinted at it in your first question also when you talked about why Muslims sometimes do not want to talk about it, because we already maligned from left and right. And so we don't want to, dish our, like the dirty laundry in front of the people. So how does this discussion of domestic violence relates to all of these other wider narratives about Islam, Islamophobia, and so on?
So I think it's so important to talk about that, because I don't think we can understand what happens with this domestic violence work, or for that matter, with anything else that American Muslims are doing at any point in time, without recognizing that we're always under the gaze of people who may not have positive perceptions of us. And so in a community, or in plural communities that are constantly under state surveillance, under threat of hate crimes, and really just at the center of a type of othering and alienating criticism that is not in the same way leveled at, for example, other religious communities, changes everything about what we do and how we do things, right? Like, we're constantly thinking in some ways about what the wider public is going to say about us. And so I ended up trying to address it head on by starting the book. The first content chapter is about media, representations, is about the ways in which domestic violence, specifically in Muslim communities, is reflected and talked about in wider media narratives. I will say, and this was a real surprise to me, when I started the project, I was really concerned that even the advocates that I was finding out about wouldn't want to talk about it for this dirty laundry reason. And I was surprised, and kind of still am, that everyone I talked to about that said, yeah, that's really important. However, what we're doing is much more important. And so we're going to be talking about it. We can't stop these efforts because it might make us look bad. That's just not good enough a reason. And I was impressed with that. And I still think that it is amazing to push back against this, basically this double narrative of let's not talk about it, right? So there's one, what I said earlier, acknowledging that it exists is hard for people and is uncomfortable. And if it's doubly hard because it also makes the communities look bad, then it's even more amazing that the advocates themselves push through and say, no, neither of these are good reasons to not try and stop people from getting hurt in those ways. I think there's a broader question here as well. And so I want to just mention that the book does focus in some of the sort of core chapters on Muslim advocates against domestic violence, but not only within Muslim communities, but also beyond them. So I think in one of the chapters about the relationship of Muslim advocates with the state. So with state funding, with law enforcement, so questions of how is the work of Muslim anti-DV advocates also framed and shaped by what is and isn't possible in these wider political dynamics. And then secondly, there is a chapter that looks specifically at interreligious efforts against domestic violence, which are really interesting because contrary to sort of what I think of in my own work as unfocused interreligious dialogue. So religious people just talking to each other because it's nice to talk to each other and be religiously plural. That work on a specific cause, and this is one of them, is really productive because it focuses the efforts away from where are we similar and where are we different to what can we do in our communal structures that we recognize. I mean, I think there's much more to say. Yeah. Every time you ask me a question, I'm like, I wrote a 200+ page book about it. So clearly more to say.
Absolutely. And really one way of looking at this, and this is also for all of us and for our audience, is that we obviously be able, even if this was just purely a book talk, even in a 90 minutes pure book talk, you wouldn't be able to address all the issues that the book raises. So one of the ideas is that people will be stimulated by this conversation and that they will go ahead and buy the book and then read it and then engage in discussions about it with their own families, communities, with the author, with everybody else. I have a final question for you, Dr. Hammer, and if you could answer it in a minute or two so we could keep it on time, I think that would be great. And that is, as an academic in this book, you do not shy away from positioning yourself as also an activist on this issue. And I think you mentioned that clearly in the book. Why is that important? And how can academics in general, but Muslim academics in particular, bridge the gap between the two? We hear often people in the community saying that, you know, the academics are out there, they are doing really great work, but we really don't know what they're doing and how their work should inform what we're doing. And then we hear academicians sometimes say, well, the communities are too inhospitable or they don't really understand what we're doing. So why is it important that you're approaching the work the way that you do?
That is a very hard question to answer in 2 minutes. And I'll start with the part where that's not necessarily appreciated in the academic context. So the commitment that I express now very openly as a scholar activist is not something that's necessarily getting me academic accolades, because there is a sort of pervasive idea that knowledge should maybe be produced for its own sake and not for any other purpose. I see my job as an academic as someone who produces knowledge that is useful for making, I'm going to sound really corny for a second, but that makes the world better. That acknowledges that we have a responsibility as Muslims to not just be here and pray enough to, you know, go to Jannah, but to actually do something about things that I think are human injustices, things that humans do to each other. And at the same time, I'm confined by being an academic. I'm not a grassroots activist. I was in the past, but I no longer actively do that. And so writing about activists and advocates has been a way for me, one, to go back to where we started, to highlight work that is happening that many people don't know about. One way in which I think the book is an activist book is that it's really accessible compared to what some other academics write. Pretty much anyone can read it and get something out of it, and that's intentional. I can write complicated theoretical stuff, but I decided to write it in a way that is accessible. And I'm hoping still that it's also an opportunity for reflection. So what I'm trying to do is not tell advocates how to do their work, not at all. I'm not trying to be critical for the sake of being critical. I'm hoping that it allows those who want to read it to reflect on some of the dynamics of their work that I saw in my ethnographic work, especially falling by the wayside because everything is always urgent, right? There's an urgent need to do this work. There's an urgent need to have a workshop. There's an urgent need to provide services. And it can be difficult for grassroots organizations to sort of step away and say, what's the bigger picture? Is there a way in which we could reflect on what we've done and what we want to do? And so that's a very limited type of activism. And the other part of my activist work is teaching everywhere and all the time. Anyone who wants to talk to me about this book, you were talking about sort of advertising it, and I appreciate that. The bigger portion for me is if someone who is watching here or listening is interested in a conversation, I'm happy to talk more about it. Email me and I'm happy to answer questions and engage in further conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammer. That's such a wonderful, I think, opening to our panel. Gives us a really good background and the foundation for what we're going to talk about. I'd just like to remind our YouTube audience that our chat function is available. You can submit your questions and comments there. And we have also posted the biographies of all 4 participants there, and that's where you can also find their biodata, as well as, in some cases, their emails. Like Dr. Hammer said, she is open to talking to people, and so feel free, I guess, to use that. So we're now moving to our second participant, and that is Dr. Zainab Alwani. She is a professor of Islamic studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and I've sent her a few questions. She's decided to make the answer in the form of PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to share that with you. And the only thing I will ask is to try to keep it to 10 to 12 minute limit, as we agreed on, as much as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ermin. Thank you, Dr. Hammer. It's good to see you. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I really, I'm honored to be among all of you. And of course, we work together on different occasions. So my topic here is about the Quranic model for harmony in family relations, which is also part, it was a chapter book in Change It From Within. And can you please just also get to the next slide? This, of course, when I came in to America in 1990, of course, we met with Sister Sharifa Al-Khatib, may Allah bless her soul. And of course, we were among all kinds of different scholars and activists. And at the same time, immediately being also involved with the community. So the question about the family is not something new, and even about the issues, the problems of marriage and marital issues was very clear. The main thing is also in my work, and I think also it's, Dr. Hammer mentioned that each one of us has a responsibility, and that responsibility we have to take care of what is on the ground and how we deal with all the complex questions and issues, and to raise even the question, how to answer those questions, and especially if you know people, and how do you deal with the domestic violence, and how do you define that kind of domestic violence? What does it mean? Is it something? The first thing that I found, even I remember I discussed it with Sister Sharif Al-Khatib at that time. Domestic violence as a concept itself is not for Muslim community at that time. They don't even recognize it as part of our issues or problems, because it's more as maybe Western concept. So that's what also it comes to bring me back to the Quran. So the Quran and the main sources of the Quran and the Sunnah is how to read the Quran in a holistic way to answer all the questions and how to define those concepts that related to these issues. And that's what itself, this kind of holistic methodology or holistic reading of the Quran clearly help us to define the Islamic worldview, the Quranic concept that related to these issues, the higher values, maqasid Quraniya itself when it comes with Tawheed, Tazkiyah, and Umran, and also to evaluate our behaviors and cultures. And that kind of evaluation also, it was part of how to study this and how to apply it as a methodology. In the next slide, it gives us what is the Quranic worldview, and this it helps us to really define the gender relationships, or the meaning itself, the status that started with find out about the insan, human being, our responsibility on this earth. And that's when it comes with, of course, reading the entire Quran from the beginning to the end and defining different concepts and tracing the word itself to find this. And that's when it comes, of course, in Surah An-Nisa, the first ayah about humanity as one person and created from male and female, and the concept of zawjiyah or pairing. And then also the role of both men and women on this earth, which is maybe in the beginning, it's a general and it's a big picture, but that's also help us to understand where to stand when it comes with the answering the difficult issues related to domestic violence. So men and women are trustees on this earth, and they have that responsibility and that role. The next slide, when it comes with gender relations in practice, and that's when the issues really comes on the ground. And we found, of course, different concepts, awliya or wilaya, and sometimes wilaya or authority. It's the misconception of different concepts. And one of this, it's really when in Surah Tawbah, Surah 971, when it comes as protectors of one and another. And if we are protectors and we define that relationship very well, in this case, from where it comes this issue of domestic violence, and why someone is hurting another person, and especially in that intimate relationship between husband and wife, and of course, parents and children. In the next slide, now, the main thing is about the family, and the family in Islam is very clear in the Quran, how many details about that relationship, about the rights, about responsibility, about the values and the principles, the systems itself. When it comes with marriage, what does it mean, marriage? What is the objectives and the maqasid of marriage itself? And all this, of course, it doesn't take only a few words, but that's the work that we have been working on with Salma, with Imam Magid, with Amberine, and even to start the organizations to work on this, that's part of it. And also, mainly the other issues about divorce. For example, the way that how we really found it's a peaceful solution for a failed marriage. And this by itself, it took experiences, it took studies, it took also how the Quran itself represent this. The extended family, it's supposed to be the support, the source of support to both the husbands and wife and the children, and which represent also the many ummah in a way. The inheritance, it's not only inheritance, but in fact, the family financial support system to provide for the nuclear family, and specifically here, husband and wife. So the next slide, the question is about that role of family and how to really to strengthen the family, especially here in America, in that community, while they don't have that extended family. And the main issue that with the focus, of course, when it comes with domestic violence, is the concept of qiwama, or this concept, is it responsibility versus power? Is it why it's on the ground, as we talk about about the debate on Islam and culture, and when Muslims coming from different cultures, they have different understanding of the responsibility of the husband and also the wife. So how to deal with this within the Quranic concept. And then now I'm working really for the not only the qiwama in the sense, but tracing that concept throughout the Quran. It will provide more information about this. The next slide is also about of course, the relationships and what is the ultimate goal of having the family, the relationships between husband and wife, the children. And this is by, you find it, of course, in the Quran, is not only this relationship on the ground here today on earth, but the reality, how do you extend this relationship after life, and how the Quran really help us to extend that goal, the ultimate goal, to that the end of our lives. And that's what it becomes very also emotional, that you can't imagine someone who hurt someone here on this earth that will even think about to continue to have that relationship at the end. And also the meaning itself. How do you bring that compassionate and love and tranquility to this relationship, to build it here, and then you continue in the hereafter, and especially with the spouses and children. The next slide. Now, that's when also you can't imagine Dr. Hammer, that in the beginning, especially in the 90s, 80s and 90s, to come to define that domestic violence, and to go back, and that question that comes from the community itself. What does it mean, this domestic violence? So when you come to define it Quranically from the Quran and from the Sunnah as a form of oppression, it took energy, it took efforts, it took courage to present it to people, and how to convince them this is part of what we are doing. So the Quran, of course, the Quranic model doesn't define the concept is just as a definition, one definition, but reality is to define it with a network of concepts. And this is a form of oppression. And that's what we have to trace, all the related concepts. And then, of course, it also, the Quran defines by behaviors and actions, and the impact of that behavior. And that's when it comes with the abuse, the physical, the emotional, the financial, and all this. And you connect it together to come with the holistic meaning of this. Also, the Quran identify a plan. And that's when in the next slide, what does it mean? Okay, this is about it comes with the cultural experiences, with the Quranic teaching, and we have to have strategies how to tackle this, how to explain it, and of course we find this in Surah Shura. In fact, this is a mutual consultation in 42. It's a system, it's an entire plan of action there, and how you really first you have to identify and bring or raise that kind of awareness for the victims and for also the abuser and the entire community, to have it as a support system. So in this, working on having this Quranic model also to identify the wrong behaviors, and if we identify the wrong behavior, how can we change this and replace it with the positive ones? The next slide, change it from within. And that's, of course, also the title, that it takes the effort, the communal efforts, and how we define, identify, and text and examine, and then reevaluate our strategies, if it's working or not. And it's a collaborative work between the scholars, the imams, the counselors, the legal system, friends and families, how to educate them. So in that case, they will support and be as a source of support for the victims, and also, of course, for the abusers, because we are building the main goal is how to stabilize the family and bring back that tranquility and love. And so that's what I think all the efforts, and then it comes from that Quranic model, raising awareness, and then how to educate the entire community and work together to end, inshallah, domestic violence in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zainab, for this wonderful and rich presentation that echoes many of the themes that Dr. Hammer talked about. And it also is a good segue into our discussion with our next panelist, and that is Imam Mohamed Magid, because you ended up with talking about the role of imams and counselors and lawyers, all kind of different members of the community, and the imams obviously need to be at the forefront of this activity, of this effort. So Imam Magid, first of all, welcome to our panel, and thank you so much for finding the time to be with us today. So I'll start with the first question, which is, can you tell us about the imams' efforts, what the imams, yourself included, and the book that Dr. Hammer wrote writes about this quite a bit. You are mentioned in the book. All three of you are mentioned in the book quite many times, actually. So tell us a little bit more about your efforts together with other imams in addressing this issue of domestic violence.
I was muted.
Go ahead.
I have double mute. Make sure that I mute myself in the computer and the microphone, so that make sure that I'm muted.
Okay.
Now I'm mute. Thank you so much for inviting me. Bismillah wa salatu ala Rasulillah. And thank you, Dr. Hammer, Dr. Zainab, for this good, wonderful presentation. I just want to say that, and I'm so happy that would be my Salma Abugideiri. It's Salma, whom I work a lot in training imams with. I want just to say that imams are being faced with the reality of domestic violence in their work every day, if it's not, every week, if not every day. What I mean by that is we know it is wrong. We know that it has to end in our community, but how do you navigate this very complex culture, packages, understanding of people come with different background? American community, Muslim American society that, like Adam Center, very diverse. And therefore, the issue of addressing an issue like this, it requires understanding how to tackle it from the theological point of view and understanding what people believe to be expectation of relationship. You have to deconstruct so many things in addressing this issue. But number one issue I'd like to mention is how to advocate for the survivor. When somebody comes to sit before me and says, I'm afraid, my husband threatening me, I feel I'm like walking on eggshells. How I should react to that as an imam? It is the issue that I think every imam in America been confronted with. And therefore, the first things I believe is that for me is to think about the safety of this person. Not get them in theological debate of role of men and women, and not to get them into that. To immediately the practical things is survivor, like safety. How can I help that person? And who can I refer them to? And therefore, I'm happy that in our community, we have some like organization like Faith that provide some this kind of work, and there's some other mainstream American culture places where people can go to. And also to empower that person to say to them, don't ever think it is okay to stay in abusive relationship. There's no excuse for anyone to be abusive to you. And don't think it is your mistake. There's a victim blaming where people say, oh, what did he do? Because majority of people in subject to domestic violence are women. And many times the person asks a woman, what did he do? Tell me why he hit you. That's the wrong question. That's the wrong question to begin with. The question is supposed to be, how can we be able to help you? You don't deserve to be abused. You don't deserve to be hit. You don't deserve to work on eggshells. That's the question that, how can we help you? Therefore, as an imam, that's what I do. But I don't do this by myself. I'm so glad that I've said there's many activists in my community that do this, and I'm very grateful to all the three great women in this panel of their contributions of really helping us to create awareness in our community. And when we have Salma, Sister Salma, to come to Adam Center and do training and talks about these issues, it creates more awareness and more women, especially women, some coming forward of what they experience in their home. And that's why you put in the bathrooms of Adam Center literatures for women so that they can take it in the, someone, no one have to see them. Because you put it in public eye, somebody will see who's doing what. And to use the Friday sermon to speak about this issue, about what the peaceful family look like, the title of your book, what peaceful family look like, that, defining the peaceful family. And that is very important for all of us. I seem like all of you are frozen. Is that from my side?
We can hear you. I think everybody can hear you. So sometimes there is a bottleneck somewhere.
Yeah, because I see you always frozen.
I think I see everybody clearly.
Yes, my
and
internet
is
sometimes
moving,
is not stable. Okay, for me, everyone is frozen, but that's fine. But that's what I was talking about. That's the role of the imam, is to be able to navigate these challenges in our community, and to ensure the person who come before me as an imam is that there's no blame on them if to leave the relationship. and divorce is not supposed to be something that a person think of like a stigma, and that I cannot, if I leave off from this relationship, will be condemned, I will be judged, especially talking about in the eyes of God Almighty. For those some of the things that I do as an imam, I work with the larger community, because domestic violence is not a Muslim problem. It is a human problem. And we, as in the Muslim community, we have to address it within our context and to see how can we address it from the Quranic perspective and the Sunnah of Rasulullah.
Thank you so much for this really comprehensive answer. It has actually answered some parts of the second and the third questions that I had. And I can also attest to the fact of being a member of your community that that your community and you yourself always raise this issue and speak about it publicly and promote the ideas that would facilitate and be conducive to peaceful families. So this definitely is something that is attested in your work. In your opinion, Imam Magid, what are the best ways to educate our community at the grassroots about this issue? You've spoken a little bit about it already, but maybe you can give us some specific examples of what your community and American Muslim community. You also had been president of ISNA, so you worked on a national platform as well. So what can our communities do at the grassroots level to educate ourselves about this?
As Dr. Hammer had mentioned, she mentioned the tragedy of Sister Asia. I remember when that took place, I wrote an open letter to the Muslim community. And that have shook the Muslim community, actually, because he is a guy that, doing all kind of media outreach and, present himself as an activist in the community and so forth. And all of a sudden, for me, all of a sudden, not for her, all of a sudden, she's been asking for help in her community, and people who have missed, all the signs, and even her crying out for help. And just I was so upset about this, and I wrote about it, and I said, there's no imam in America should second guess a woman who's tell you that I'm in an abusive relationship. And no imam should tell a woman, be patient and go back to your husband. No imam have no right to do so. Because it's not only her, after had other women that have lost their life. And therefore, this is very serious. And I feel like I'm an imam, as an imam, if I tell a woman, go and just be patient with your husband, and something happened to her, I have blood in my hand. That's how serious that I think about this issue. Therefore, I think the aspect of this in the Muslim community, in terms of no one should get away with abuse, whether he's a member of the board of mosque, whether he's a donor, whether he's a scholar, whatever the title might carry. The fact that the Prophet ﷺ defined the goodness in human being by the relation with their family, that's enough. خيركم خيركم لأهلي, the best among you, the best to their family. That is the criteria. For me, that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of this is that the how can we do premarital counseling? I do premarital counseling, and to tell young people or whoever getting married, even if it's not young, how do you define abuse? What abuse look like? And I looked. I'm a little biased in my counseling a little bit. I looked at the man in the eye. I said, you have to know there's no justification of abuse, no verbal, no physical, not emotional, no abuse. And I asked each one of them if they know what the word abuse means and how they define abuse. Therefore, it's very important for us to do that, to educate people before they get married. People take courses for everything. If you are an IT business, there's certification for every level, and keep up to date. But when they get married, they think that, okay, I don't have to do anything. And they think they drive through. They call you 11 o'clock at night and says, Imam, can you get us married? They say, okay, I'm in my bed. I'm in my pajama, about to go to sleep. They say, oh, what are you talking about? They said, well, in your parking lot. Really? There's no drive-through marriages. Therefore, we don't do that kind of stuff. Therefore, that's very important. And then we have to differentiate as Imam between counseling and mediation and arbitration. And we are not law enforcement. Therefore, we have to tell people to seek help from the right authority. They have to go to court. There's something of protective order. I'm quite sure someone will talk about that. How do we tell people what are their rights to protect themselves? And they refer them to right agencies. The last things I want to say in this issue is in the issue of educations. You have to remember, some people don't speak fluent English, and when they come to us about the issue, I ask them, do you understand me, or do you need to have someone to translate this? Because sometimes they might speak in Arabic, they speak in Farsi, they speak in Urdu, and they might pretend that they understood me, but I want to make sure. And we're talking to men, women who have been brought to this country with their husband and visas and process of by which they come to this country, they're in disadvantage. And the husband all threatened them. She has a green card, he's a citizen. If you do anything, we're going to throw away. And she doesn't understand English well, and the husband goes to the court and give all kind of talk. And men, women, they go in deep depressions, because they know that they live in an abusive relationship and they cannot get out of it because they cannot advocate for themselves. And therefore, when they come to me as an imam and the husband is speaking fluent English and barely she's speaking, I have to know why she's not talking. Is it a lack of language? Is it a language problem? Is it being intimidated? Why she's not speaking? And therefore, he says all kind of things, and she walk away, and then she asked somebody to call me to say, tell the imam I couldn't say anything. I couldn't understand what my husband's saying. I'm being abused and living in fear. It happened to me twice, and in the beginning, then it became enough for me. Then I ask, do you need somebody to translate? Do you need to be help? Because that was the imam supposed to be catering to everybody before them. The last things, and this real last things, I think that one of the issue of education in issue of domestic violence, whenever you put a seminar and the title of the seminar domestic violence, no one comes. They don't. Everyone in denial. Oh, I'm not going to come to that. But call it peaceful family, call it healthy marriage, they may come. And therefore, when they come, then you can address the issue. But if you say domestic violence, like, no one can come. Therefore, I learned my lesson that people pretend that everything is, going well in their relationship until you tell them that there's certain aspect that you need to rethink it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Imam Mohamed Magid. Obviously, there's a wealth of experience that you have, and thank you for everything that you do and for sharing these wonderful thoughts with us. Before we move on to our final presenter, and that is Salma Abugideiri, I would like just to read a few comments from our viewers. We will take some of the questions later after everyone had finished speaking, but I just want to read a few comments so that you can see how our conversation is reverberating against, with our viewers, and to give them a voice as well, so that it's not just 4 or 5 of us speaking. I'm going to skip a few questions. I'm just going to read some of the comments. So Hanifa Isabella is saying, what I'm reading at the moment is Gendered Morality by Zahra Ayubi. And in case you haven't actually seen my conversation with Dr. Ayubi, we spoke on this channel a month or 2 ago. So please watch our conversation where we go in depth into her book and discuss the issues that she raises. And then Hanifa says, and I can't deny the destruction of justice when the balance of gender representation is present. while ethics were managed for a specific group of men dominating socio-political world, were also adapted into domestic sphere. And perhaps the renewal of ethics should be done with concept of female and male needs as not only equal in Allah worship, such as prayer or fasting, but also in treatment in whole life dynamic. Anna Bigelow says, thank you all so much for this critical conversation. I volunteered at a shelter for survivors of domestic violence in the early 1990s, and there were big challenges, and the big challenges was dealing with the police and the courts. And then she has a question for Dr. Hammer, which we will come back to after Salma is done speaking. But I just wanted to read these couple comments to see how our what we're discussing is echoing with our viewers. So now back to our panel, and our final panelist is Salma Abugideiri. She's a counselor and a therapist. She's also a founding member of Peaceful Families Project. And for that reason, I'm going to start our conversation with that. The title of the book is Peaceful Families. And obviously it is in a way, and maybe Dr. Hammer can confirm, it is a nod to your project in many ways. So, and obviously what many others are doing. So can you tell us a little bit more about the organization, Peaceful Families Project, and the work that you do? We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to thank you and the center for, bringing us together and having this opportunity to talk. When Dr. Hammer did this research, it's been, about 10 years now since we met and she did the research. And we were very excited that she was going to be documenting these efforts. Peaceful Families Project, the organization, which I'll refer to as PFP, just to avoid confusion with the book. But PFP began its work in the year 2000, responding to an urgent need. And Dr. Hammer mentioned that word several times, urgent need. We're responding to an urgent need. And so the founder, Sharif Al-Khatib, who had conducted one of the first surveys, preliminary surveys in the Muslim community to determine if we are experiencing domestic violence in our communities, which she already had a sense about that, but to get some data about that. And in her very preliminary survey found that about 10% of the leaders in our community were reporting that they had experienced domestic violence. And so since that time, we have done more surveys, and we have much better statistics, which I can talk about if there's time. But the organization really responded to these scenarios like the one that Imam Magid gave, and where women were really struggling to figure out how do they navigate their abusive relationship. People really feeling either mistrustful of existing services in the broader society, or not even aware of those services, or facing language barriers or cultural barriers, so many barriers. And so really Sharif Al-Khatib founded this organization to respond to what she felt was a critical urgent need, and that there was a really big gap in the services as well as in the knowledge base and information that was available to Muslims who are suffering in these relationships.
Thank you so much for this. As a practitioner, and I cannot stress enough how important the work that you do is, and how grateful we all are for all the work that you and your organization and everybody else who works on these issues do. What are some of the main issues you have encountered in your practice in relation to domestic violence? What are the common issues that are repeating themselves in our community that we can be aware of, and maybe even as members of the community sort of pay attention to in our families, in our wider communities, and learn from your efforts and from your practice?
Sure, thank you. I mean, the issues that I see are really, in some ways, the same as any practitioner would see in any community. And I think that's really important, that in many ways, Muslims are the same as any other group of people. And so people who may not really have, as Imam Magid, was suggesting, that people may not have prepared adequately. And so they don't actually know what is a healthy relationship. They may not have the tools, whether it's communication tools or conflict resolution tools. People who are struggling with sort of the shifting roles of gender and what does that mean in our relationship. People who come from families where there has been this intergenerational cycle of trauma. And so people may not even recognize that they're in an abusive relationship because it's either been normalized in their families or normalized by society. And, one of the issues, that Imam Magid kind of started to mention is about sort of the complicit role that many people play in contributing to domestic violence. So for example, if a person is, going to the Imam and the Imam is telling her, go home and pray more and be more patient, and you're going to be rewarded for your patience, instead of, what he was saying, you need to go and seek safety, and you need to know that this abuse is not acceptable. So then, what's specific, again, not just to Muslims, but to many people who from different faith traditions, is the struggle of understanding, how do I make sense of this abuse from within my religious context and understanding? Is my faith telling me that I need to be patient and I need to endure this abuse, or is my faith telling me that this abuse is wrong and I should leave, I can leave and I should leave? And then the big question is, and then where do I go? Where am I going to go that will support me as a person of faith? Then when we look at the Muslim context more specifically, we have very specific questions that people struggle with, that are related to the way that we have been taught, historically, the way we have been taught Islam. And, so maybe a good way to, give an example is, a story of someone. And all of my stories, they may resonate with people, but they are stories that I've heard over and over and over again. So I can tell you a story, and it is the story of hundreds of women. It's not a specific woman. And I say that, to also protect anyone from feeling that I'm talking about them. But truly, these are common stories, unfortunately. So a woman who is kicked out of her own home in the middle of the night, in her nightgown, in the snow, and door is locked, and now she's outside, right? Then the husband proceeds to divorce her. And by the time I meet with her, her dilemma is, divorce is a sin. This is what she's saying to me. Divorce is a sin. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala going to say about me as a divorced person? And so, the reason that I really began my working relationship with Imam Magid so many years ago was because of this recurring question that women were struggling with the fact that they're being divorced, not with the moral and, the moral issues related to being abused. So they're not seeing that, they're victims, but they were worried that they're doing something that's problematic because they're divorced, and not even voluntarily being, divorcing, but they were being divorced. They were being kicked out of their homes. Questions that, and this is really a question where we look at culture and religion, because we know culturally in many of our, cultures, divorce is problematic, but Islamically it's not problematic. And this is one of the ways that culture and religion comes up frequently. Another scenario that comes up very frequently is when people are struggling with Islamic texts being used against them as control tactics. And so, in other faith communities, those texts could be, biblical texts. In our community, it's Quranic text and hadith, where specific hadith, and women will say, are the angels going to curse me for disobeying this man who has beat me all day, who has kicked me out of the house, or who humiliated me, or who threatened me? So these are the kinds of, questions that really led us to recognize the need to develop resources and materials that address these very specific, concerns. And of course, we have the big issue of stigma, and nobody wants to talk about it, and yet many people are suffering from it. In fact, our research tells us that in the Muslim community, over half of the community has experienced some kind of abuse in their family context in their lifetime.
Thank you so much. The final question I have is, how can the wider community get involved with the Peaceful Family Project and the work that you do? How can people become more aware? How can they be better educated about the issues that you do? How they can contribute in whatever way? Can you please share that with us?
Sure, I really appreciate your question. I mean, to begin with, I invite everyone to visit our website, peacefulfamilies.org. We are continuously adding new materials and resources. We've updated some of our older resources, and we have started to develop some multilingual resources. So we're really excited, from the time that Dr. Hammer, met with us, our team has grown tremendously. I'm really grateful that we have, a core of trainers now and many more resources available. So that would be a first step, is familiarize yourself with the materials that we have. And, if you are a subject matter expert, then please feel free to reach out to us. COVID has made us very comfortable with online programming, of which I was a vigilant protester before, but we are now doing online programming. And so it's easy actually to host different subject matter experts and, anything that's related to healthy families. And that's a pretty broad range of things. So reach out to us. We do always appreciate having volunteers. If you have some special expertise in a range of things from social media to fundraising, Dr. Hammer did mention the issue of funds. Donations are always appreciated, and no donation is too small. We also would encourage people to spread the word. And so beyond getting involved with our organization, and more importantly, is that every person know that, you can make a difference in ending domestic violence simply by speaking up against it. So, share this webinar with people, share the webinars on our website, share the brochure, share crisis hotline numbers, speak about this as much as you can, because the more that we talk about it, the more that people will understand that this is something they can come forward and get help if they need it, because we know that it exists and it's more common than we'd like it to be. And there is no shame on the person who has experienced domestic violence.
Thank you so much. And again, we are all grateful for the work that you do and everybody else here on this panel and all around the country and the world in raising this issue, raising awareness about it, educating communities, and most importantly, stopping this type of behavior. We're now at 3:20 mark according to our Eastern time, and according to our plan, we only have about 10 minutes left. It is obviously very hard to keep it on time that we initially planned on, because there is so much knowledge to be shared on this panel, and we could go on. And we do hope that we will continue this conversation under the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World with other institutions, and that hopefully, inshallah, when we are also able to go back in person, that we will do more in-person trainings and workshops in raising awareness about this issue. So because we do not have too much time, and I know our audience has been with us very, very patiently, and I really thank them for that. I would like to take one or two questions from the audience. Here is Patrick Da Silva. He's asking, this is a question for Dr. Hammer, but after she answers, if anybody else would like to contribute to this, and perhaps is most applicable to Dr. Zainab, because we're talking here about the activist-oriented scholarship. So the question is, Dr. Hammer, you mentioned that you do not receive academic accolades for engaging in activist-oriented scholarship. Do you think that is changing at all?
I think we should try and be optimistic about that. And I do think it is changing. I would say that it's partly changing because I'm not alone in doing that work. And there are scholars in fields like ethnic studies, African American studies, critical race studies, women and gender studies, who have always embraced the idea that the purpose of their scholarship is actually making the world a better place. So I will say, maybe I sounded a little bitter about the lack of academic accolades, but that was also not the reason why I wrote the book. And so this is probably the most sort of crossing into communal engagement work that I've done. And if the price of that is, you know, some people in my field in religious studies, which is not activist oriented as a field, not being excited about that, I'm actually not terribly worried about it. But I also think the field is changing. Our field is changing.
Thank you. And maybe I'll ask the same question of Dr. Zainab, because she also straddles both worlds, and she's a scholar, but she also does a lot of work in the community. Dr. Zainab.
I think for me, the question that what the issues or the problems, the challenges in the community, it opens the door for me also for research, for more research to find the answers, because I feel as I said, every one of us has, we're standing on specific maybe ground, and this is our responsibility. And to take that responsibility seriously, we have to, at least when we are discussing about culture and Islam and issues facing our community, it's a question, it's a research question that we have to find the answer for. And what Sister Salma and Imam Magid mentioned about many women, victims themselves, but they don't know about what they're going through. And this by itself, what kind of answers that as a Islamic studies scholar to find the way to answer not only to one only for the academics, but mainly for that victim and their families, and of course even for the abusers and the entire community. So the connection between the two is for me is very clear. This is a question that it comes as a research question from the community, and I am also as a scholar, I need to find the way and approaches to how to answer the question inaccurate in the trying to reach that accuracy. But of course, it goes back to the community and to the research. So it's an open dialogue between the two.
Thank you so much. We have another question. It is also addressed to Dr. Hammer, but I would like to invite others, and especially Imam Mohamed Magid, to comment on this as well after Dr. Hammer, because I think he might have quite a bit of experience in dealing with this. And the question is from Anna Bigelow. She says, Julian, you mentioned that part of your book was focused on the state institutional interactions. Could you or any panelists speak more on the specifics of those dynamics? State institutional interactions.
So it's going to be hard to be brief and also get the nuances of this right. I will start by saying that it's clear that Muslim communities are under state surveillance, that they're, especially in the last 4 years, but even long before that, have been treated in particular ways by state authorities and by law enforcement. There is a significant dimension to anti-Muslim hostility that is an expression of racism. Our communities are predominantly Black and Brown communities in the United States have experienced systemic racism. One of its forms, as we all know, not only since Black Lives Matter, is police violence, especially against Black people. I want to make the point that I do make in the book. Over 30% of American Muslim communities are African American, and so are doubly, if not triple, affected by these types of dynamics. And I talk in the book a little bit about it because it came up in some of the conversations I had, especially with imams, about discussions in Muslim communities around law enforcement, especially around calling the police in a domestic violence situation. That's a very complicated field. There's a lot of research and criminal work about how differential treatment by law enforcement plays a role there. And it is a difficult question. If you are a victim of domestic abuse and you're a Black Muslim woman and you know that your community has already been affected deeply by police violence, do you call the police to help you? Or what other options do you have, right? So that might be one way in which Muslim communities, as communities of color, are sort of implicated or affected by state structures in ways that some other communities who also experience domestic violence might not be. So a white Christian woman or a white Jewish woman may not ever have to think about that aspect of the dynamic the relationship with the state. The other piece is maybe not as dramatic, which is that the US state, including the Department of Justice, has had a complicated relationship with religious organizations. And within that, over the past 30 years, the relationship between Christian faith-based organizations has been different than that with especially Muslim ones. And that too affects things like state level or federal funding, the possibility of certain types of projects being supported. So again, not as dramatic as the relationship with law enforcement, but certainly important. And then the third piece is the legal system that is also not treating both people of color and Muslims specifically for related reasons in the same way. It's not an equitable or equal legal system that is experienced by all in the same way. And so that becomes, in some cases at least, an additional roadblock, basically, right? So like an additional impossibility, because if you cannot go to the court because you're not going to be treated the same way, then one of the avenues for addressing domestic violence issues, the criminal justice system, is not open to you. And then on the level of protection, simply calling the police so that the abuser is taken away for at least some time, that might not be an option in ways that are specific to Muslim communities as communities of color. And again, there's a lot more to say about that. I say some more about it in the book. And clearly this is where the anti-Muslim hostility connection comes in really strongly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hammer, for this very comprehensive answer. But I would like also to invite maybe Imam Mohamed Magid, because I assume that in your role as the Imam, you often have to deal with these issues in practice, and maybe you can share with us also some of your perspectives as well.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with Dr. Hammer in the issue of Islamophobia impacting the issue of addressing the issue of domestic violence. I'll give you an example of that. When people see the anti-Muslims, propaganda and so forth, and they see sometimes the state do certain things to Muslim community, they become hesitant reporting domestic violence. Because sometimes they're worried that someone might not going to believe them. They don't know how a person will see a woman wearing a scarf react to her. All kind of things. And there's a lot of assumptions, about all of this dynamic government community relationship. The other aspect of this, I do believe that is understanding just cultural aspect of this. Sometimes the law enforcement will go to somebody's home and the woman will say, I'm not ready to talk to you. She wants to dress in a particular way and those kind of things. And then instead of waiting, he had a conversation with the man, take a report and leave sometimes. All of this aspect of it is important for us to have in mind. And the last thing is that when they go to the court of law, sometimes they don't realize that if Islam become part of the discussions, women get shut down. Because now she would have to defend her religion. Instead of defending herself, have to defend her religion. And she feel any bias from the judge toward Islam, against Islam, she become defensive. They called me, said, but they said this is your religion, and somebody made a comment on my religion. I don't like them to believe that Islam is this because my husband look at us as a religious man. And I said, you are not in defense of Islam. Does not need your defense. Your defense is defend yourself, but by doing that, you're defending Islam. Don't worry about defending Islam because your husband look religious, and those kind of things. For all of that kind of aspect of it, it played a role in how people reporting issue of domestic violence and how court sometimes look into those issues. In I think in New Jersey, remember what the court says? The judge, and he created a problem. He said that it's okay in his religion. It is you using Islam. The minute people start using Islam, the court is not a mufti, cannot tell people what they think Islam is. They have to look to the fact on the ground. Somebody abused somebody, hold them accountable like anyone else. Don't tell them, oh, your religion, that was really a horrible move from a judge to try to interpret Islam against a woman who complained about abusive husband.
Thank you so much, Imam Mohamed Magid, for this also wonderful perspective. Now, we basically ran out of time, and I know there is so much to be talked about, and it just shows how much need there is to be talking about this. I am in general not in favor of extending too much because people have planned out this time to be with us and they have other plans, and everybody does, so do many of you. So I would just like to conclude this by asking one final question from our audience, then giving each of you maybe 1 to 2 minutes to just answer that question and say maybe anything else that maybe you wanted to say you didn't have a chance to address so far, but to really try to keep it very brief. And the question is, and to make it also timely and topical for the moment that we're living in, the question was, how has the pandemic affected Muslim communities in particular? We know that COVID disproportionately affects persons of color, people of color communities. Adding domestic violence into this unfolding tragedy must complicate your work. So how has this COVID been complicating, and if at all, your work as it relates to domestic violence? So I'll just go in the order of appearance, as they say in the movies. So first, I would call Dr. Hammer to conclude her presentation and address this question.
So I would say this is the one question that the other 3 panelists can definitely answer better than I can, because they are still doing work on the ground. I will say the very obvious, which is that while we use the word unprecedented, we know that any kind of social situation that keeps people in their homes, that increases stress on families and that increases stress on communities, leads to an increase in domestic violence. And I think we will need years to actually capture properly how dramatic that increase very likely has been. One, so the increase itself, we know that there's an increase, there's an uptick in domestic violence around holidays. So imagine 8 months of, well, what is definitely not a holiday situation, but an especially difficult situation. So that's one aspect. The second one is that despite that, and really tragically so, of course, all the work to address domestic violence, especially the service work, is also hampered and restricted by the inability to do anything in person. So I can only imagine like how dramatic how dramatically that has affected the work that my three esteemed panelists here and many others have been doing. And because I'm not going to get to talk again, I'm also going to say that it's been really powerful for me to be on this panel with Dr. Zainab and Sister Salma and Imam Magid. And I hope that what it really has done is what was also the purpose of the book, which is to uplift and to highlight and to make visible this enormously difficult and enormously important work. And if this Forever There YouTube video does some of that, then I have met my own expectation of why I wrote this book in the first place. And I also am very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
You're most welcome, and it's really a pleasure to have you and everybody else on this panel. As we say, may it be on Mizan al-Hasanat for the Day of Judgment, inshallah. So, Dr. Zainab, any reflections on this final question or any final reflection would like to share?
Just thank you. Really, it's just to invite us to this. We have been for a while, of course, working together. I'm sorry, let me just. But it's just wonderful to be with all of you. And of course, with the COVID, I guess, yes, of course, it adds to our work. But at the same time, I did a series about mothers of the believers in Ramadan, and it was mostly really is also from one or another way how to address different issues, and having the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet to be as example for people are at home as families. But to my surprise, I received, after a while, I received so many calls and so many emails after that, how people are really suffering in their families, and especially during COVID time. So I think our work will continue, and inshallah, we work together on this. Not only to end domestic violence, but also to build the peaceful families and bring that tranquility to the world. Not only because the family is the cornerstone of the society, but we are working for the world. So may Allah bless all of you, and thank you very much for inviting me here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Zainab. It was a pleasure having you on this panel. Imam Mohamed Magid.
I want to say that thank you so much for bringing people in academia with an Imam, and Salma also, she does training. Therefore, she's considered like a professor on all right. And Dr. Ermin, really thank you for your center, bringing us to highlighting this issue. Dr. Hammer, thank you for highlighting the issue in your book and cause this discussion to be all of with you. I would say that COVID made it not easy for us to be able to counsel people in person. Some people may be, unfortunately, I can imagine some people who are suffering of domestic violence. They used to do a walk-in to the Adam Center, but they don't have technology. Maybe a woman doesn't know how to use a computer. She doesn't know how to make an appointment, on Zoom. And that woman, she missed that opportunity for getting the help maybe she need. That is really, really one of the things that I'm thinking about those people who don't have the same access to service because of COVID, and they're suffering in silence. For my heart goes to them, and I pray that they find a way to be served. If they were walking in the mosque and they're using, facilities, and in the facilities they find a pamphlet, and now they don't know where to go. Those are the people I've been thinking about, to be honest with you. And therefore, it's difficult to imagine how people can be locked in with somebody is abusive for 8 months and there's no way to get help. May Allah help them, inshallah.
Thanks so much, Imam Mohamed Magid, for these words. And finally, Salma Abugideiri.
Yeah, I feel bad to be the last one because I don't want to end on a depressing note. To answer your question, how has COVID, kind of impacted domestic violence? To be honest, I don't think we're going to know the full answer to that until after this is over. But if we think about, the control tactics that are used in domestic violence, isolation is one of the sort of basic ones, which is to keep the person who's being victimized from contacting other people. So in this situation where we are required to keep distance, and depending on where you live and what period of time during COVID, the amount of isolation is really extreme. So that in and of itself complicates and really increases the level of challenge for people who are living with their abuser, right? So pre-COVID, being in an abusive relationship is awful, and the abuser or the victim may be going out for work, maybe going out for school. They're not confined in the same space. So there's some opportunity that you look forward to for some breathing room. Many of the domestic violence resources organizations also had to shut down for some time. Some are opening again, depending on where you live. But recently I learned of a situation where a woman needed to file a protective order in court. Typically, an advocate would go with her to the court, but the advocate said she can't go because of the pandemic. And so these are situations where people are not getting the support that they need, as Imam Magid said. There's also, because of the pandemic, there's a new control tactic, which is that the whole issue of potentially contracting the virus can be used against someone, so you're not going to go to the doctor's appointment, you're not going to go to this appointment because you might bring the virus back, or she might have COVID and you're not allowed to get medical attention. So the ways of controlling the person now, we have a new way. The other thing is that this pandemic and the stress that all of us, of course, have experienced triggers pre-existing mental health issues. And so people who suffered from anxiety before, it's going to be higher. People who are already experiencing depression, it may be higher. And of course, people who have pre-existing trauma also may be triggered by some of the things that we are putting in place to protect us, which, wearing a mask and, the isolation, but these things can also trigger people. So there is, it's kind of a unfortunate and fortunate situation to be in as a therapist. Our business is not one of those businesses that's suffering, but that's sadly because people are really suffering right now. So this is a very difficult time. The good news is that everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so even COVID will end and the pandemic will end. And inshallah, we can look forward to post-COVID, and this will be something that we reflect back on. But what I would like to say, to everyone is that we still have the ability to stay connected to each other, right? And so it's especially important during this time that if you know someone who may be in an abusive relationship, that you really be a good listening ear. And that listening ear, just simply listening, could really make such a tremendous difference in that person's ability to have hope and to keep going, until they're able to get more resources. So don't underestimate your ability to help. Just by listening, you don't have to actually do anything, because listening in and of itself is an intervention, and it's very, very powerful. Just to be there and to believe a person and not to blame that person. We have a toolkit that will be released very soon, inshallah, if it's not already on our website, which is Domestic Violence Toolkit. And there are some tips there in terms of how you can respond. And there's an existing older brochure on our website also with tips, how you can respond if you know. And so use the technology and be there for people and know that you're making a difference. So I also want to thank all of you. Imam Magid and Zainab have been really instrumental in helping me personally in this journey, as well as Peaceful Families Project as an organization in developing resources and materials. And, you know, it's true that people don't want to talk about domestic violence, but, you know, when someone like Dr. Hammer comes and says, I'm going to shine the spotlight, you know, on the work that people around the country have been doing, then that lifts up that conversation. And so that I hope will also, you know, further our efforts. And thank you so much to Dr. Ermin and the Center for giving us this opportunity.
Dr. Ermin, may I announce also, building on what Salma said, we will have a new issue for the journal, Islamic Faith and Practice on Domestic Violence for next year, inshallah. Please, all of you and the audience, if they have anything to contribute to this issue, we will appreciate it. We are continue the work of all of you, and especially for also Salma and Imam Magid, inshallah. Thank you. And Dr. Hammer, you are invited to contribute to our journal.
I have a plan, and the deadline is tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me now conclude this conversation by, first of all, thanking you all once again for this tremendously useful panel. It's been a phenomenal conversation, very uplifting, even if the topic is difficult and many of the issues that we discuss are hard to hear. At the same time, knowing that there are people out there who are researching about this, writing, working in the trenches, working with the grassroots, it's just so uplifting. And I thank you all for being leaders in our community and providing, not just in American Muslim community, but I would say in the wider community as well. You are really the shining lights, and I pray that you continue doing what you do. Number two is just to sort of to recognize Dr. Yunus Mirza, who actually had started this conversation. He's been the one who's actually done all the scheduling and everything. And so I just want to thank him for not dropping the ball, even when COVID struck us and we had to change our plans. Our initial plan was very different. And finally, to mention in relation to COVID that our center actually did a survey of Muslim students during COVID. We did that really at the beginning, during the first 2 months of COVID. And the survey and report are available on our website. And one of the things that our survey showed is that Muslim students, and I'm assuming just as any other students, are really experiencing a higher level of mental health difficulties and issues. And these, and we have the numbers in the survey and so on. And it would be nice maybe at some point if we do have the means to do a follow-up survey and then compare the results beginning of COVID with, you know, let's say 1 year into COVID, how the students feel. And that would give us some data that everybody can work with. So once again, thank you all. Our audience, if we didn't take every of your questions and comments, it's because of time constraints. We're already almost 20 minutes over time, but I thank you for your time, for listening to us. And I hope that we have answered at least some of your questions and addressed some of your comments. So once again, everybody, thank you. Stay safe. All the best to you and your families, and Assalamu alaikum.